Is Clark Phillips the answer for the Falcons at nickel cornerback?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be talking another explanation of why it's paramount that the Falcons are definitely taking an edge rusher in round one. We'll talk about where the value exists for the Falcons to get a cornerback after round one in the draft. But the main topic that we want to talk about is revisiting the Clark Phillips conversation when it comes to his potential to fill that nickel cornerback spot. We talked about that on yesterday's episode with Dave Choate of the Falcoholic. We got Dave's thoughts on it as, you know, Clark potentially being that plan A. And so today we'll get my thoughts on it, and we'll take a little deeper look into my thoughts on whether or not Clark Phillips is going to be their plan A as far as the nickel cornerback position. And of course, this all stems from comments that Raheem Morris made at the NFL league meetings the other day, where he talked about how Clark Phillips was going to get some run at that nickel cornerback spot. And to me, it's a similar conversation that we're having with Ryan Newsom, where whether or not that's a good plan or not. It's, you know, is Clark Phillips your best option, or is he actually a good option, right? We've seen historically over the years with the Falcons, and like my opinion on like Ryan Newsom, why I apply that to this, like, I don't know if Ryan Newsom is a good option to be your starting center, but as we sit here today, he's your best option. It's similar to conversations we had in the past with guys like Michael Walker at linebacker and Jalen Hawkins at safety, where it's like, I don't know if these guys are good options to start for you at, you know, their respective positions, but based off of the current construction of the roster, they may be your best options. Now, you know, we'll talk a little bit later about an alternative option that the Falcons have at the position, but let's focus on Clark Phillips. Now, if you recall, when we drafted Clark Phillips in the 4th round in that 2023 NFL draft, you know, I was not that high on Clark Phillips's ability to project as an outside corner, right? I thought he did not have starting potential as an outside corner, mostly because he lacked the physical traits. He lacked the height, the length, the speed, the athleticism to hold up long-term as an outside corner. And through 2 years, we've seen positive plays from Clark Phillips, but nothing that tells you, hey, this guy is going to be the answer at the outside cornerback spot. We talked about this going into last training camp, where we talked about how Mike Hughes is going to be the week 1 starter. And the question is going to be, is Mike Hughes going to play at a high enough level to maintain his grip on that starting position through week 18? And or is Clark Phillips going to play well enough in order to take that spot? And the answer that we have definitively got based off of Mike Hughes's play in 2024, as well as the Falcons' decision to re-sign Mike Hughes this past offseason in free agency, is that we didn't get the fall of Mike Hughes. He was solid. No one's going to say and tell you that he was spectacular, but he was probably an average starter, right? Probably on a 10-point scale, somewhere between a 5 and a 6, let's say a 5.5. And Clark Phillips did not show enough in alternating reps with Mike Hughes to make you think that, oh, he'll be a better option than Mike Hughes at that point, which is something that you heard me talk about when we drafted Clark Phillips. Now, the thing that you heard me also talk about with Clark Phillips, that if he is going to be a starting caliber corner in this league, it's going to be at the nickel position. Now, the problem is he lacks the physical traits to be an outside corner, but he lacks the physical disposition to be an inside or nickel corner manning that slot position. And that's an important element of playing the nickel, which is, as you guys well know, that, you know, the base defense, you have 4 down linemen and 3 linebackers, and then the nickel, you sub out one of those linebackers for a nickel defender. And then some teams, they play that big nickel where that's a safety, and other teams play where that's a cornerback, right? And you need that defender, whether it's a safety or corner, to basically bring it in run support to make up for the difference, especially in today's NFL, where the vast majority of, you know, times teams are going to be playing 60% or more 3 wide receiver sets, which defenses are going to counter by playing nickel, and teams are going to run against you. And that was something that was really problematic for the Atlanta Falcons last year, which is that they could not defend the run in their nickel formation. And again, that's not all due to the nickel cornerback play where they had D. Alford formerly at that spot, but Clark Phillips is definitely going to have to bring it. And that's been the big question with Clark Phillips. And that was the big question I had in terms of whether or not he would make it as a nickel corner. Like, I thought he projected better as a nickel corner because he wouldn't have the issues from a physical standpoint dealing with, slot receivers as opposed to the outside receivers, right? It's not to say that the AJ Browns of the world don't line up in the slot, but that's not primarily where those guys line up. They primarily spend 60, 70, or 80% of their time on the outside, right? And those are mismatches for a player like Clark Phillips. And so the question with Clark Phillips was, at Utah, he made a lot of business decisions, right? When it came to run support. And that was something that I talked about he needs to get better at in the pros, or else he's not going to make it in the NFL. He's not going to last in the NFL. And so that's going to be the challenge. Now, I think to Clark Phillips' credit, I think he was better in terms of run support in 24 than he was in 23, but he needs to make another leap in order to be a trustworthy nickel cornerback. And so to me, the biggest challenge for him currently on the roster is Natrone Brooks. And that's the thing about Natrone Brooks is Natrone Brooks does bring that physical disposition to that nickel cornerback's play. We saw that all over the film in the preseason last summer, that basically Natrone Brooks is fearless when it comes to, I'm going to stick my nose in there. I'm not afraid to stick my nose. And so into the run game. And so to me, that's going to be the biggest challenge for Natrone Brooks, which is like, how good in coverage is Natrone Brooks, right? We've seen him at the nickel, like the majority of his snaps in the regular season last year came in the nickel. The previous year under Ryan Nielsen, when he was a defensive coordinator, we saw a significant number of snaps, at least in the preseason, of him in the nickel. And so the question is Natrone Brooks good enough in coverage, right? But he has the physical disposition, and Clark Phillips, good enough in coverage. We've seen good coverage play from Clark Phillips, but does he have the physical disposition? And really, the reality is, if you can merge those two players, Clark Phillips' coverage ability with Natrone Brooks' run support abilities, that would be the perfect nickel. But right now, those two things are separate. And so the question is going to be, right now, as we sit here today, with those two guys being your top options at the position, which one of these guys is going to make a significant enough jump between now and the start of the regular season to potentially win that position? Not to mention, you also do have Mike Hughes, who did serve as your nickel cornerback in the back half of the 23 season. Mike Hughes does have that physical disposition and also has, at least in theory, the coverage ability, although it didn't look great in the back half of that 23 season. So we've known that Mike Hughes historically has always been a much better cover guy on the outside than as on the inside, but he is at least a fallback option there that, at least in theory, kind of merges the two players together for the Falcons. So we'll see if the Falcons decide to invest significant resources in the nickel cornerback position. Is a position of need right now, because I don't think you sit here again thinking, oh, Clark Phillips is a good option there, but he may be your best option right now. And so we need to see this team solve their cornerback problems, whether that's an outside corner and that's going to bump Mike Hughes inside, or whether that's a nickel corner that's going to allow Mike Hughes to be able to utilize in his best way. That the Falcons need to walk away from this 2025 with at least one solution at the cornerback position. And I think that makes the most sense on the outside. And so we're going to talk about all the ways that the Falcons can invest the resources in this draft, particularly in round 2, to potentially solve this cornerback problem as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we know that there's nothing quite like watching your favorite teams live and in person, and getting tickets to see those teams shouldn't be stressful. And that's where Gametime comes in, because they make it easier to grab those last minute seats at unbeatable prices. Whether you're looking to see your favorite sports teams, or you're just looking to laugh at comedy, listen to music, or, culture yourself with theater, right? Whatever event is near you, Gametime is making it easier to get the tickets thanks to their featured Gametime Picks, which is going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. With their panoramic seat views before you buy, the no surprise fees at checkout when you toggle that option on in the app, or their lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence with Gametime. by downloading the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So when we look ahead to the 2025 draft, we know that the Atlanta Falcons are going to take an edge rusher in round one, and we'll circle back to that topic later in today's episode on why we are so certain about that eventuality. But I think there's a prime opportunity for this football team to take a cornerback in round two. And hopefully that will solve the problem that has existed, that they've had a revolving door at that cornerback spot opposite AJ Terrell for all 5 years that AJ Terrell has been here. They have gone through a different starting cornerback in week one. This year is the first time that they might get back-to-back guys, if that's Mike Hughes as that outside cornerback. But we know that Mike Hughes is not a long-term solution at the position. We know he's more of a stopgap. And that's been the problem with this regime that we'll touch upon a little bit later in today's episode. But they don't really do a great job solving problems. They do a really good job, or a really good job is certainly debatable, but they do an effective job, plugging holes and having stopgaps. But really, this is their last golden opportunity from a draft standpoint to solve some problems. And cornerback has been one of those problems. And I think, in the coming weeks, I'll certainly take a deeper look at some of those day two corners that will be options for the Falcons potentially in round two, because again, we know that they're not taking a cornerback in the first round. And hopefully some guy will catch my eye and I'll be like, this is the guy that we're hoping is going to be there at 46 or whatnot. Or maybe there will be a guy that I'm like, I don't think this guy's going to be there at 46, and we can even potentially move, or he will be there at 46, but he may be there later and we can move back, a couple of spots and pick up a mid-round pick or whatever in a trade back and still get a really good cornerback. But some of the guys that, I haven't necessarily done a deep dive on yet. Well, I have done a deep dive on one of these guys, in Azareye'h Thomas, the cornerback from Florida State, Maxwell Harrison from Kentucky, Siobhan Ravel from East Carolina, Trey Amos from Ole Miss, Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame, Darian Porter Jr. from Iowa State, or some of those guys are being projected as round two guys. Maybe a couple of those guys slide up into the first round. But for my money, at least one of these six guys should be an option for the Falcons in round two at pick 46 or whenever they wind up picking there. And hopefully that will be, we'll come away watching the film in a couple of weeks and being like, yeah, this is the guy that we should be circling as their replacement or their long-term answer at that cornerback spot opposite, AJ Terrell. And the reason why you take a cornerback in round two is because it's a premium position, right? That outside corners are a premium position. Nickel corners, not so much. Teams tend to not value those guys. You've seen it with high-level nickel guys like Cooper DeJean and Brian Branch, being projected as like top 10, top 15 picks early in the draft process, but falling to round two, surprisingly, and despite those falls, still playing at a high level immediately in the NFL, as many people thought they would. But, I've looked at some of the data that indicates that, like, typically teams, if you want to wait, like, you can wait on a nickel cornerback and still get probably a decent option. But if you want an outside corner, you're going to need to invest, high level resources. And, I did just a quick, brief research, nothing scientific, but just looking at OurLads.com and the depth charts that they have currently for all 32 NFL teams, and looked at all the guys that were currently listed as, starters for those teams at all three cornerback spots, and only really paid attention to the guys that have entered the NFL since 2020. So over the last 5 years, and looking at all those guys and where they were drafted and how they were picked. And basically, that 5-year sample of players account for about 58 of the 96 starting cornerbacks in the NFL. So about 60% of those guys. And, again, this is not the most scientific, just because roughly half of those players were drafted in 23 and 24 of those 58 that we're talking about. And that's not necessarily because teams were drafting especially well at the cornerback position in the last 2 years, especially, but it's just those younger players typically are quote unquote given opportunities in the first 2 years of the NFL, and the cream eventually rises to the top. And so once you get 3, 4, or 5 years in the NFL, it's sink or swim time. And so a lot of those guys go by the wayside. So the general idea is that if the Falcons are looking for a starting cornerback, the idea is this is where they should potentially target him. But you look at the hit rates in terms of drafting cornerbacks in round one, and just looking at the players that are listed at cornerback, as opposed to a couple of guys like Tyke Smith and Jalen Petrie that were part of this data set that are listed as safeties, but looking at their positions as what they were listed at cornerback, and the hit rate for round one was 64%. 64% of the first round cornerbacks taken over the last 5 years are currently starters in the NFL. That hit rate is about 57% in round two. It drops to 47% in round three. Then it drops off significantly to 27% in round four. And then it jumps back up to 32% in round five, just because teams have been especially good in the 22 and 24 drafts, finding some fifth round value at the cornerback position. Those are drafts where Tariq Woolen, Tarheeb Still, among several others, have been hits for teams in round five. So that's why round five is a little bit better than round four at 32 to 27%. But if you just kind of take those two drafts, 22 and 24, out of the data set, the hit rate for round five is about 13%, which is roughly on par with what the hit rate is in round six, which is about 15%. In round seven, that's about 7%. Now, the other thing that stands out when you look at these, the players in terms of outside versus nickel cornerbacks taken in each round, about 11 outside corners are current starters from round one versus 3 nickel guys. That ratio is 9 outside guys to 4 nickel guys in round two. Then in round three, it's 6 to 3. Round four is 3 to 4. So it basically, after that first 3 rounds, right, the premium is where the outside guys are. So there's a lot more outside starting cornerbacks relative to nickel cornerbacks in the first 3 rounds. But then it basically evens out on day 3 of the draft, starting around 4, where you have 3 outside guys to 4 nickel guys. Round 5, you have 5 outside to 4 nickel guys. Round 6 is 2 to 2, right? Round 7 is 2 outside guys versus 0 nickel guys. And there's also, with undrafted free agents, there's like 2 outside guys and 2 nickel guys. And so that basically is telling you, like I was saying, like if you want to get an impact outside corner, if you want to solve the problem of finding that long-term option to play opposite AJ Terrell, your best bet is to take that guy in the first 3 rounds. Obviously, the Falcons have only 2 picks in the first 3 rounds as we sit here today. We know that one of those picks is definitely going to be used on an edge rusher. So that, to me, makes it the prime opportunity in round 2 to find that outside guy. And so there's, to me, a clear path for the Falcons when it comes to how they address their cornerback needs, right? That if you're going to target a cornerback in round 2, that should be an outside guy. If you're willing to wait, if you think the value at another position, like say D tackle, is there in round 2, and you want to punt to round 4, that's where you can potentially still be in a position to land a nickel guy when your next pick is. But in my opinion, that priority should be that second round outside corner, right? That's going to solve that problem across from AJ Terrell, where you could pencil in that rookie starter, hopefully for the next 4 years, right? As your starting outside corner, that's going to be the next 4 years are going to be the remaining prime of AJ Terrell. That's going to push him through his like age 30 season where he's going to drop off. And hopefully by the time, hopefully you hit on that second round pick, and then by the time it's time to pay that guy, then that guy will be sort of assuming the role from AJ Terrell as your sort of number one corner. And then you can just kind of restart the clock all over again at that point in time. But, I don't look at the current combination of the Falcons 3 corners in AJ Terrell, Mike Hughes, and Clark Phillips as changing the math on where this position group is, right? That we saw last year at the end of the season, that when you face teams like Minnesota that had multiple high caliber receivers like Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, that you really struggled to stop them because the drop off from AJ Terrell to your number 2 cornerback was significant. And the reality is that if you just basically run it back with 3 out of the top 4 cornerbacks, you just basically remove D. Alford from the equation, you're not really solving that problem. We've saw what Mike Hughes and Clark Phillips did against the Minnesota Vikings, and it wasn't good enough. And so you need to upgrade that position. Get a guy that can cover the Jordan Addisons and hopefully the Justin Jeffersons when AJ Terrell's not on him. You have teams like the Miami Dolphins that have Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. Washington, now that they have Deebo Samuel along with Terry McLaurin, right? The Rams just picking up Devontae Adams in addition to Puka Nacua, right? These teams, in addition to your own division with Mike Evans, who's always giving you problems, along with Chris Godwin, but these teams that have multiple good receivers really gave the Falcons fits. You saw the Seahawks game with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett and JSN. DK Metcalf really gave this team problems, right? And then when you look ahead, when we're envisioning a world where the Falcons are competing for the playoffs, right? And they're playing some of these teams in January, Philadelphia Eagles like A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Detroit with Amon-Ra St. Brown and potentially Jamison Williams, right? These teams, you need to get another cornerback in here if your goal is to not only make the playoffs, but also win playoff games, right? And we know that AJ Terrell also struggles against sides, right? So you want to find a guy that can match up against some of the bigger wide receivers that you're not only going to face this year, but potentially in the future, like a Mike Evans, like a Marvin Harrison Jr., like a Keon Coleman, like a Michael Pittman Jr., like an AJ Brown, etc. So I don't feel like the Falcons have to overthink this when it comes to the cornerback need, right? They've been punting on edge and cornerback for multiple years now under Terry Fontenot, and they should just stop punting and just simply solve the problem, right? And it's like, every other problem area for your roster, at least on the defensive side of the ball, theoretically, you can solve in free agency, right? At D tackle, linebacker, safety. There are good players at those positions because they're not premium positions. And so therefore teams are willing to let solid to good players hit the open market. And we've seen that consistently over the years because they're not premium positions. But when we see edge and cornerbacks, like, it's hard to find premium players at those premium positions because basically if you're good at those spots, teams are going to pay you money and they're going to keep you and they're going to prevent you from hitting the open market. And occasionally you'll get a Josh Sweat, occasionally you'll get a Chase Young, but outside of those guys, like, it's not really prime time players hitting the open market. And when they do, you got to pay out the wazoo. You got to spend all of your cap space. And as we discussed with Mark Ramundi the other day on the podcast, like, the Falcons are not in a position where they're going to have a ton of cap space in the future, given that they're going to have to pay Drake London potentially $30 million, Bijan Robinson potentially $20 million, Michael Penix Jr. potentially $60 million a year over the next 3 off seasons, assuming that those guys earn those big time, high level second contracts and whatnot. And so the Falcons aren't going to have the flexibility to go out there, we'll just drop $25 million on an edge rusher or a corner in order to upgrade those positions. So if they want to upgrade those positions, they have to do it in the draft. It has to be the priority in the draft in rounds 1 and 2. In my opinion, they have 2 paths to solve the 3 big holes on their defense, right? An edge, cornerback, and D tackle. Path A is you take an edge in round 1, edge, cornerback in round 2, and then you can kind of wait on a D tackle in round 4. Right now, you could also go down the path of, we'll take an edge rusher in round 1, we'll take a D tackle in round 2, and then we'll wait and get a nickel guy in round 4. And of course, obviously if the Falcons add draft picks via trades, that will change the math on that. But I think because of the need that you have at the D tackle position, which is really a need for a run plugger, right? You don't need to prioritize that in round 2. You can wait until round 4 with this draft class being deep enough with enough run pluggers and nose tackles that you should be able to get a good, solid day 1 plug and play starter at that D tackle position in round 4. Maybe you can get that sort of plug and play nickel guy. But again, I think the priority should be finding that outside corner, right? And so we'll just sort of have to see on this. But it's one of those things where the Falcons have to be able to solve these problems. They can't keep getting away with this, right? And so that's going to lead us to, will they have the cojones, so to speak, to be willing to draft that edge rusher in round 1? And I want to make it clear as we wrap up today's episode why exactly the Falcons have to take an edge rusher in round 1. So here's a not so fun fact for all of you guys that I'm sure you already know. Do you know which team has the least amount of sacks over the last 4 years since Terry Fontenot has been the general manager of the Atlanta Falcons? 2 guesses, and your first guess should be the Atlanta Falcons, and you would be correct. You don't even have to make it to your second guess, right? And the other issue with that is the gap between the Falcons and the 31st ranked team, which is the Carolina Panthers, in terms of the number of sacks that they've had, is the same as the gap between the Panthers at 31 and the 24th ranked team. So basically, if you were to visually, express where the Falcons stack up to the rest of the league, they're all kind of by themselves on an island alone in terms of having a completely inept pass rush. Now, the thing that we've heard over and over again over the last several years, particularly over the last 3 years, especially under Terry Fontenot, is like, the Falcons, they just got to solve their quarterback issues and so many other problems going to go away. And sure, if the Falcons were able to land an MVP caliber quarterback, then that would mask a lot of their issues. But the quarterback position has not been the biggest thing holding back the Atlanta Falcons relative to the rest of the league, right? That when you look at their production, their efficiency, over the last 4 years under Terry Fontenot, if you look at adjusted net yards per attempt, they rank 18th over the last 4 years combined, right? If you look at passer rating, they're 24th over the last 4 years. And so you split the difference between those two rankings. Let's say they basically have the 21st best quarterback play combined over the last 4 years, whether we're talking about the final year of Matt Ryan, Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, and then Kirk Cousins, right? And so no one's going to sit here and tell you, hey, man, having the 21st best quarterback is good enough and whatnot. But it's far from the sort of thing that the biggest anchor on this football team, right? The gap between where the Falcons quarterback play has been over the last 4 years and what they need to get it to in order to be a consistently good team isn't that far. Like you compare it to, say, the LA Rams, who have been, a playoff team, especially over the last couple of years. Where do they rank in terms of passing efficiency over the last 4 years? They're 15th, right? So the gap between 21 and 15 isn't this huge jump. And of course, we're hoping that Michael Penix will allow the Falcons to make that leap this upcoming season. But the interesting thing about the Rams is that they have been that good offense without a great defense. And yet when you look at where they rank from a sack standpoint over the last 4 years, they're 15th. And so the point I'm trying to make is the jump from 21 to 15 in terms of what they need to be in order to be a playoff caliber team on offense isn't as massive as a jump that they need to make in terms of their pass rush from 32 to 15 in order to be a good enough defense, right? We know that the Rams haven't had great defenses in most of the last 3 or 4 years, right? 22 and 23 and 24, they were below average defenses, but yet it didn't stop those teams in that 2 of those years from making the playoffs. And so 32 to 15 is really where the Falcons need to make that jump. And the point I keep stressing and will continue to stress over the next 3 weeks between now and the draft is it's virtually impossible for the Atlanta Falcons to make that sort of leap if they're not willing to invest the premium resources in upgrading that pass rush. And the Falcons have invested resources in their pass rush under Terry Fontenot over the last 4 years. They've taken 7 pass rushers across the last 4 drafts. 5 of those guys were day 2 selections, 2nd and 3rd round picks, but it hasn't solved the problem. And so now in 2025, you can't continue to do the same thing that you've done for the last 4 years and not invest a 1st round pick in your edge rusher. You need to try something new and invest that 1st round pick in an edge rusher, right? For 4 years, we've watched this team punt at the edge rusher position in round 1. And for the most part, we can look back and say, okay, maybe we disagree with the decision, but we can at least forgive you. Like in 2021, right? Well, 21, 22, and 23, the Falcons invested premium those 1st round picks into offensive skill position players. Why? Because Arthur Smith was the head coach and he needed dudes on his offense to make it work. And in 21 specifically, right, the general perception at the time that we knew, based off the information we knew then, was that there was not an edge rusher, there was not a pass rusher in that draft worthy of the 4th overall selection where the Falcons took Kyle Pitts. Of course, Micah Parsons completely obliterated that narrative, but the general perception was Micah Parsons was like 11th on the consensus board. Kyle Pitts was number 2 on the consensus board. The best true edge rusher, because again, we didn't know Micah Parsons was going to be Micah Parsons at the time. He was being evaluated as an off-ball linebacker, right? Basically Jahad Campbell or whatever. And the best true pass rusher, edge rusher in that draft class was 15th in Kwity Paye on the consensus board, right? So it was understandable that the Falcons were willing to bet on the higher caliber prospect in Kyle Pitts that we perceived at the time, right? 2022, the Falcons took a wide receiver in Drake London over alternative options in terms of Jermaine Johnson or George Karlaftis. And again, the excuse is that you could say, hey, we'll get the edge rusher in round 2, which they got in Arnold Ebiketie. And you could say, well, Arnold Ebiketie's not that big a drop-off between Jermaine Johnson and George Karlaftis. And hopefully Arnold Ebiketie will deliver on that by producing the type of years, 8 to 10 sacks this upcoming season to make that look even better in hindsight. And then, of course, 2023, you had the safe pick in Bijan Robinson. You had the less than safe pick given the character issues with Jalen Carter, not to mention you already had invested at the D tackle position with Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. And we talked about throughout that entire pre-draft process, whether it was Miles Murphy, Lucas Van Ness, or Nolan Smith, none of these guys really screamed top 10 draft pick in terms of the value. So it made sense for the Falcons went with these safe, quote unquote, home run, future all-pro running back in Bijan Robinson, and he sits here today in 2025 as by far their best player on the entire football team. And then, of course, last year they went with the quarterback in Michael Penix, and hopefully we will be able to sit here and say, hey, Terry Fontenot, you finally solved the problem because you were able to solve the problem at the most important position on your team by drafting Michael Penix at the quarterback position. So 4 years you have punted at this position, and again, you may not agree with those decisions, but in hindsight, you can at least say, okay, those decisions are defensible. Punting at the edge rusher position in round one in 2025 is an undefensible position. There's no argument that you can make. Oh, so, well, we went in a different direction because of this, right? It's not going to be because of some blue chip player falling to you at 15. It's like, we just didn't think that guy was going to be, because there aren't any blue chip players in this draft class, right? And the ones that that do exist are probably almost certainly going to be top 4, top 5 picks in the draft. And there's almost no chance of those guys falling in the draft, right? You're not going to invest in an offensive skill position because you've already invested all the resources that you need in those spots. The offensive line, right? There's certainly a path for the reason for the Falcons to draft an offensive tackle or a center this year, right? If there was a center worth that, if there was a Tyler Lindenbaum in this draft class, we might be having a different conversation about the Falcons potentially drafting a center in round one. But there is no Tyler Lindenbaum in this draft class, right? And you're not going to use a first round pick on an offensive tackle that's just going to sit the bench behind Jake Matthews and Caleb McGarry. Right? You need 3 plug-and-play starters at edge, corner, and D tackle. You can't waste a premium draft pick on a player that's not going to play till 2026 when you have desperate needs to get guys that are immediate contributors on this defensive side of the ball, right? So, and then you look at the defensive needs, right? You could use more help at D tackle, corner, safety, linebacker, etc., right? But you can wait on all those positions. You cannot wait on an edge rusher. You cannot spurn an edge rusher at pick 15, right? You can't sit there and say, oh, we'll just wait till round 2. We'll wait till round 3. We'll wait till 46, right? And more than likely, right, if you take an edge rusher at 15, you're probably getting the second or third best edge in this draft class, right? If you wait till 46, you're probably getting the 8th or 9th best edge rusher in this draft class. And there's no way that you can sit there and say, we prefer the edge 8 to edge 3 or whatever. Now, you can make the argument, as I have made on this podcast, that, hey, the drop off from edge 3 to edge 8 is probably not as significant as it is in most years. But frankly, I don't give a damn about that, and nor should you. Right? If you absolutely love the 8th best edge rusher in this draft class, or at least the guy that's projected to be the 8th edge rusher in this draft class, then take him at 15. If you love him that much and you value him over some of these other guys that you could potentially take, then take him at 15. Right? You cannot justify any other selection other than a edge rusher in round 1. Right? That you turned in your draft grades back in February. And if you weren't convinced that, oh, there's not going to be a guy that we love at 15 back then, right? And that was 2 months ago, guys, right? Then you should have been more aggressive in free agency to upgrade the edge rusher rather than settling for the same bet that you've made for the same 4 years in a row at that edge rusher spot with Leonard Floyd, right? Which is the same bet that you made with Matthew Judon and Bud Dupree and Lorenzo Carter. And the reason I say that is if you look at those guys' pass rush win rates in the years prior to joining the Atlanta Falcons, they're virtually the same. Carter's was 8.6, Dupree's was 8.3, Judon's was 8.9, and Floyd's is 8.4, right? And none of those, so I sit here absolutely certain or whatever that, you're not going to get anything more out of Leonard Floyd that you got out of Lorenzo Carter or Bud Dupree or Matthew Judon. None of those guys solve the problem. And so if you're going to solve the problem, you have to take an edge rusher in round 1, right? When we talk about, well, it's going to be different this time. It's not because Leonard Floyd is going to be a difference maker over those other guys. The reason why it's going to be different this time is because you're finally going to draft that edge rusher in round 1. So I sit here and say you reap what you sow when it comes to the Falcons draft. The Falcons have the terrible pass rush, an outlier of a pass rusher on an island by itself, a devastated island, right? When it comes to their terrible pass rush. And that's because they haven't been willing to sow the seeds with that premium draft pick in round 1. And so I sit here, guys, telling you right now that if they do anything other than take an edge rusher in round 1, that episode that we do reacting to round 1 on Friday morning at 12 a.m. Eastern time, midnight, whatever, after night 1 of the draft, I will absolutely have the crash out of all crash outs. I will make it my mission for the remaining 3 months of this podcast between the end of the draft and the start of training camp to prey on the downfall of this regime, right? It's the beginning of my villain era. My villain era will consist of pumping Penix and also preying on the downfall of Terry and Raheem. All right. So I sit here, guys, there's no other option as convinced, and it is what it is. Now, I say all that, despite all of that, there is one other option, which is if they trade for Trey Hendrickson, then maybe they could justify passing on an edge rusher in round 1 because they seemingly solve the problem with Trey Hendrickson, the NFL's leading sack artist, right? Who is definitely not in the same conversation as Lorenzo Carter and Bud Dupree and Leonard Floyd in terms of potential impact. So that would be different. And, there's some growing buzz coming out of the league meetings that, the Bengals being able to extend Trey Hendrickson is not necessarily as certain as it would be. And so that will be a topic that we will potentially explore tomorrow as we are joined by Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, as well as get Jarvis's other thoughts on all the buzz emerging from this league meeting and Clark Phillips and the nickel cornerback and the center position and all that stuff. And so we will discuss that tomorrow. So make sure you make Locked On Falcons by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to make us your first listen. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft to hear what Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez think about those high-end edge rushers, those high-end corners, those high-end D tackles, as well as other positions that may be on the Falcons' radar. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.